Hi everyone, my name is Rowan Lacey and I'm an Irish whisky ambassador with Irish Distillers. In this section, we're going to be looking at brown spirits. Brown spirits are ones that have been, with just a few exceptions, aged in wood, which gives them their characteristic colour along with a whole spectrum of aromas and flavours. This category of drinks includes brandies, dark rums and whiskies. Brandy is a spirit distilled from fermented fruit, and the most well-known brandies tend to be made from grapes. Essentially, to produce a brandy, you distill a wine. In fact, the name comes from the Dutch word brandewijn, meaning burnt wine, which came to be shortened to brandy. Cognac and Armagnac, two distinct styles of grape brandy produced in specific regions of France, are the famous examples. These must be aged in casks, and the minimum age of a bottle of cognac, for example, will be indicated with terms such as VS, meaning very special, and at least 2 years old, VSOP, meaning very superior old pale, and 4 years minimum, and XO, for extra old, 6 years minimum. The grape brandy category also includes things like Grappa from Italy and Pisco from South America, which are typically unaged. Other fruits can be used to produce brandies like Kirsch, Calvados, and Applejack. Dark rums are produced in a similar way to white rum, from the distillation of fermented molasses or sugarcane juice. You can learn more about rum production in one of our other videos. The difference and the colour in dark rum is due to the use of casks to age the spirit. Many distilleries will use American ex-bourbon or French oak barrels to mature their rums. But now we're going to focus our attention on whisky, particularly Irish whisky. Why? Well, because in Ireland, in the on-trade, Irish whisky is the number 2 spirit after vodka. It has been growing hugely in popularity in recent years and is continuing to grow. Irish whisky was in fact once the most popular spirit across much of the world. Unfortunately, a series of events starting around the turn of the 20th century led to the almost complete extinction of the industry, with only a couple of distilleries remaining in production by the 1970s, down from well over 100 at its peak. Thankfully, Irish whisky has been undergoing a massive resurgence in recent years, and the number of operational distilleries on the island as we're filming this stands at almost 40. So what is Irish whisky? Well, first of all, let's start by defining what whisky is. Whisky is a distilled spirit made from cereal grains. It can essentially be made from any grain you like. More detailed rules then apply based on the country it's produced in and the specific style of whisky involved. These rules will typically determine specific production methods, cask types, and minimum age requirements, among other things. Irish whisky, then, at its simplest, is whisky produced on the island of Ireland. To label a product as Irish whisky, it has to be fermented, distilled, and matured on the island, and have been aged for a minimum of 3 years in wooden casks. However, within this category, which is one of the fastest growing spirits categories in the world right now, there are several distinct styles of Irish whisky. Arguably the most unique style of Irish whisky is single pot still whisky. This can only be made here in Ireland, and its defining features are that it must be made from a mix of malted and unmalted barley and distilled in traditional copper pot stills. It must be produced in one single distillery. This typically results in a full-bodied, creamy and spicy style of whisky. Some examples of this style that you may be familiar with are Redbreast and the Spot whiskies. Single malt whisky is made from 100% malted barley and also has to be distilled in traditional copper pot stills. This often gives us a biscuity, fruity and slightly lighter spirit. As with other styles, the word single in the name indicates that it's the product of one distillery. Some examples of this style are Napogue Castle and Method and Madness Single Malt. Single grain whisky, which can be made from a range of different cereal types, although in Ireland we now typically use maize and a little malted barley. Grain spirit is distilled in a different kind of a still, called a column still, and the resulting product is more delicate, floral, and fruity. Although less common as a standalone style, some examples of single grain Irish whisky are Method and Madness Single Grain and Kilbeggan Single Grain. Finally, if we blend 2 or more of these styles of whisky together, we have a blended Irish whisky. Some famous examples of this are Jameson and Power's Gold Label, which are blends of pot still and grain whiskies. and Bushmills, which is a blend of malt and grain whiskies. Now, while it may sound obvious, the simplest definition of the difference between, say, Irish and Scotch or American whisky categories is that one is produced in Ireland and the others are produced in Scotland and America, respectively. However, as with various styles of Irish whisky that we've already discussed, most countries have developed their own traditional or typical styles of whisky. Going back in history, these were often influenced by distilling traditions, but also by the raw materials that were readily available in a given area. For example, while barley grows very well in Ireland and Britain, in the northern parts of the USA and Canada, rye is more common because it's better suited to the harsher climate. As a result, in these areas, whisky tends to be produced from rye and still is today. Similarly, if we move further south into states such as Kentucky and Tennessee, maize or corn was better suited to the hotter climates and so has become central to the whiskies produced in those areas. Beyond the choice of grain, there are further rules, but also typical characteristics and techniques which help to distinguish these different styles of whisky from each other. In most cases, though there are exceptions, Scotch malt whiskies are double distilled. American whiskies are often distilled once using a column or hybrid still before passing through a doubler to increase the spirit's strength. Meanwhile, Irish whisky is often associated with triple distillation. Now, this is not a legal requirement, and there are several examples of double distilled Irish whisky, but it has certainly been a common feature of many of the most well-loved brands. Now, there is another aspect of some whiskies that is often talked about, and that is peat. Traditionally, many Scottish distilleries use peat or turf fires to dry their barley malt, which imparts a peated, smoky, and earthy character to the grain, and therefore to the whisky. Now, while there are a growing number of exceptions here in Ireland, this is much less common on the island, and most of the best-known Irish whiskies do not have this peated or smoky character. Now, in terms of maturation, Scotch whisky must be aged for at least 3 years in oak casks, while the most popular styles of American whiskies, straight bourbon and straight rye, must be aged for at least 2 years in new charred oak casks. In Ireland, we're fortunate that our technical file, the legal document that defines what can be called Irish whisky, states that the spirit must be aged for at least 3 years in wooden casks such as oak. So while oak is by far the most common type of cask used here, we have the freedom to experiment with more unusual and experimental types of wood, such as chestnut, cherry, and acacia. So that's an overview of the brown spirits category, and I hope you found it useful.